The world champion is back in action. Today he faced Anish Giri in the first round of the Chess Legends tournament, the latest event in the Magnus Carlsen chess tour. So I'm going to take you through one of the 4 games that they played today. This was actually game 2. Magnus Carlsen with the white pieces, and he's playing a very sensible, straightforward opening with d4 and c4, no London system today. And whenever Carlsen plays like this, I always think to myself, yeah, he really means business. And Giri plays the so-called Ragozin system, very classical, very trendy at the moment, but, well, it's been popular for decades. Bishop g5, all very normal so far. And h6 puts the question to the bishop on g5. And the normal moves here are, of course, bishop h4, or simply exchanging on f6. Incredibly, Carlsen put the bishop back on to d2, a really odd move, completely new in this position. Looks really strange. And here Giri castled. And then things really started kicking off. Now, we'll look at the game in a second, but seems to me that knight c6 is a sensible move here for black. Maybe knight d7, c5 as well. Basically leaving the king in the middle for the moment. But, okay, let's see. Castles looks like a completely normal move. But Giri was caught out. g4 by Magnus Carlsen. g4, incredible. And now we see the idea behind tempting this h-pawn forward, because now white is ready to break open the g-file and just start a really primitive attack against black's king. I mean, to be honest, I find it extraordinary that Giri didn't twig what Carlsen's idea was. But now he's under severe pressure. You know, if this pawn is taken by the knight, rook g1 anyway, with semi-open g-file, and that h6 pawn is obviously a problem. In a rapid play game, this is really difficult to defend against. Even in a normal game it's difficult, but rapid play, this is real pressure. Giri exchanged on c3 and then played the knight into e4. So, I mean, that looks pretty sensible. So, for the moment, g5 seems to have been prevented. The knight also looks at the bishop on c3 in case you might want to exchange it off later. Queen c2 from Carlsen. So his intent is quite clear. The queen is looking over at the king's side, but it could be possible to castle queenside. Reminds me a little bit of the way that Mamedyarov sometimes plays with the white pieces, actually, very directly like this. And here, well, maybe there's no need for black to panic here. Maybe knight d7, maybe b6 with the idea of bishop b7 to support the knight. So Giri played c5, and Carlsen just took this. And here, well, you know, white could be ready simply to switch strategies and play rook d1 and maybe bishop g2 and get some pressure here. Giri played b6. And now this is so interesting from Carlsen. You know, I was perhaps expecting rook g1, maybe h4, but he played g5 immediately. Very interesting. And his idea was this. After pawn takes pawn, this is the game continuation, h4. This is so direct. Now, obviously, if the h-file opens, then white is going to be very happy here. So g4 from Giri, trying to keep things close, but now knight g5. And this is already incredibly dangerous. Well, knight takes bishop is inadvisable, let's put it like that. Queen h7 mate. And if knight takes knight, pawn takes, threatens mate here on h7 already. See, the h-file is opened. There's no time for queen takes pawn. So here, Giri played f5. I mean, he has to close this diagonal, actually. And now a developing move from Carlsen, bishop g2. But you can see, because of this pawn move b6, in fact, there's now quite serious pressure on this long diagonal. Pawn takes pawn on c5 and simply castles queenside. And in this case, knight takes pawn is not going to be a problem because d5 caves in and the threats against the queen and on the long diagonal too much for black here. So there is now serious pressure on d5. Potentially this diagonal is opening towards the king. Of course, there's the pin here as well. Very nasty position for black. Giri exchanged on g5 and took the pawn. Queen takes g5. So that is check as well. And the king came to b1. Now, in spite of taking off that knight and winning another pawn, it's really difficult for black. The h-file is open. d5 is under pressure. It's desperate. And if white gets a check here, then of course with the rook on the h-file, that could be immediately fatal. So the stakes have been raised here. Knight d7, Giri desperately trying to bring a piece into the game. Pawn takes pawn. Knight b6. He realizes he has to give up material. If he tries to keep things close with e5, that's all in vain because d6 opens up this diagonal, opens this diagonal. It is fatal. So after pawn takes pawn, knight b6, and now Giri simply had to give up material. Bishop takes e6, bishop takes rook in the corner, rook takes a8. So now Carlsen is an exchange up. And what a bishop on c3, cutting down to g7. And of course there's the open h-file. To be honest, I was slightly surprised by Carlsen's next move. He offered an exchange of queens. And I think Giri's best chance was to exchange queens here. Of course, white is better, but, well, with the clump of kingside pawns, it's perhaps not so easy for white to convert that one. White, of course, is better, but Giri ducked with queen g6. And now queen d6, and this is looking pretty nasty. f4 check. King hid in the corner. And now Giri played rook f8 to defend the f-pawn. And that should have spelled the end of the game. Incredibly, Magnus Carlsen missed a standard checkmating pattern here. Standard checkmating idea. I'm sure you've all spotted it. Rook h8 check. Queen takes rook. And rook h1. Extraordinary. And then queen g7. I mean, there is no way out. Absolutely no way out. I mean, this is something that, Carlsen was doing as a beginner. Incredibly, he played queen e5. Well, he had a kind of fixed idea of attacking using the bishop on c3, which is of course very strong, but still extraordinary missed that. And in fact, he said after the game that he was a little bit embarrassed, or no, more than a little bit embarrassed to have missed that. But well, and he still has a winning position here. But a little bit of activity for black. Knight takes c4, and here again, queen takes c5 looks very sensible, with the same threat, but clearly that just wasn't on Carlsen's radar here. He played queen h5, and the endgame is admittedly very promising for white, not to say completely winning. And yeah, Carlsen clearly just had the idea to attack against g7, and it's not a bad idea at all. Okay, watch out for a little potential trick here. b3 just gives the king a square on b2. And now The G file opens. Giri blocks, but it's all in vain. And of course, this is completely winning. And in this position, after the knight check, knight takes bishop, rook takes bishop here. Giri resigned the game. Well, a convincing crush in spite of missing mate in 4. But what a sensational idea. Bishop d2. I mean, it's a very crude idea. But it worked to absolute perfection. G4, fantastic from the world champion. He drew the next game and then won game 4. So a convincing 3-1 victory for Magnus Carlsen in the first round of the Chess Legends tournament. I'll be following events there. And I'll let you know what's happening. But already some really interesting games. Gelfand defeated Ding Liren convincingly. That was fantastic for Boris, sticking up for the old guys. Thanks for watching.